The galaxy had rules. Everyone knew them. You did not challenge the Galactic Council. You did not question their decisions. You did not speak out of turn during the grand sessions, and you most certainly did not send a junior diplomat to represent your species when the entire fate of your civilization was being decided. Humanity did all four things on the same Tuesday afternoon. The council chambers floated above the gas giant Forth 9, a massive ring-shaped station that had been constructed over 6,000 years ago by a species that no longer existed, a reminder, most said, of what happened when civilizations got too bold. The walls were made from compressed starlight, the floors from a material that absorbed sound so completely that even the largest crowd felt like a library. Everything about the place was designed to make visitors feel small. It worked on almost everyone. Ambassador Dara Osei walked in wearing a second-hand suit, carrying a datapad with a cracked corner, and eating a protein bar because she had missed lunch. She was 31 years old. She had been an ambassador for exactly 9 days. The Vorith delegation stared at her like she had arrived on a garbage barge. The Selenari clutched their ceremonial robes and whispered to each other. The Kreth, massive, four-armed beings who had once collapsed a star to win a border dispute, simply watched her with the cold patience of something that had lived for centuries. Humanity had been given observer status in the Fin Galactic Council 3 years ago. It was a polite gesture, mostly symbolic, the same way you might let a child sit at the adults' table during a holiday dinner. Nobody expected humans to actually say anything. Nobody expected them to vote. And nobody, not in 6,000 years of recorded galactic history, had expected a species, barely 80 years into space travel, to file a formal grievance against the Council itself. And yet, that was exactly what Earth had done. The grievance was simple. The Council had quietly passed Resolution 7 Gamma 18 months ago. On the surface, it was a trade agreement, one that restructured shipping lanes across 4-star systems. What it actually did was cut off the 3 colony worlds that humanity had been slowly building in the Outer Rim. Not through war, not through force, just through paperwork. Supply ships rerouted. Fuel stations reassigned to Council members. The colonies were not destroyed. They were simply made impossible to reach at any sustainable cost. The Council had calculated, correctly they believed, that within 2 years, the colonies would collapse on their own. Humanity would quietly retreat back to its home system. No confrontation. No war. Just a slow, bureaucratic erasure. What the Council had not calculated was that humanity would notice, and then get angry. Dara stood at the speaking podium, which was elevated just high enough to make shorter species look ridiculous. She had read about this design feature in the briefing documents on her flight over. She had also read that speakers were expected to begin with a 40-minute ceremonial address acknowledging the Council's ancient wisdom and eternal authority. She skipped it. "My name is Dara Osei," she said. Her voice came through the translation matrix flat and clear. "I represent the United Earth Assembly and the 300,000 people currently living on the Kepler colonies. I'm here because those people are being starved out by a trade agreement that was passed without any notification to Earth, without any representation from Earth, and without any public record that most Council members are willing to admit exists. I've filed a formal grievance under Article 12 of the Sentient Rights Accords. I'd like to discuss it." The silence that followed was the kind that had weight. Several delegates looked at each other. The High Arbiter, a Selenari elder named Vos Marin, who had presided over the Council for 200 years, slowly turned her many-faceted eyes toward the young human at the podium. "Observer species," Vos Marin said, her voice carrying the practiced calm of someone who had never once been challenged in this room. "Do not file grievances. Observer species observe. Then maybe, Dara said, you should have been clearer about that before we signed the accords. Another silence. Longer this time. A Kreth delegate made a sound deep in its chest that the translation Matrix rendered as something between amusement and alarm. Voss Marin leaned forward. The resolution was passed within the full legal authority of this body. The rerouting of shipping lanes is a matter of council infrastructure, not a matter for observer commentary. Your grievance is noted and will be placed in the standard review queue. Dara pulled up her datapad. The standard review queue currently has a processing time of 40 to 60 years. The colonies have about 18 months of sustainable supply remaining. I've done the math. This isn't a review queue. It's a filing cabinet. Then I suggest, Voss Marin said, that humanity consider consolidating its population back to its home system. It would be the sensible choice. Dara looked up from the datapad. She was quiet for a moment. People would later say they noticed something change in her expression. Not anger, exactly, but something more dangerous. Clarity. Let me make sure I understand, she said slowly. The council passed a secret resolution to collapse our colonies. Put the paperwork in a queue. You knew we couldn't survive. And now you're suggesting the sensible thing is for us to give up. Did I get that right? Voss Marin's expression did not change. You are a young species. You have much to learn about how the galaxy operates. Yeah, Dara said. I'm starting to figure that out. She did not leave the podium. She pulled up a second document on her datapad, a much longer one, and began to read. It was a detailed legal analysis, prepared by a team of 200 Earth lawyers over the past 8 months, cross-referencing the Sentient Rights Accords with 14 other Council treaties, 47 precedents from prior galactic disputes, and 3 legal frameworks that the Council itself had authored. It argued, methodically and without drama, that Resolution 7 Gamma was not just unfair, it was illegal under the Council's own rules. The reading took 4 hours. Dara did not stop once. Some delegates left. Others stayed. The Kreth representative, whose name translated roughly as stone that outlasts the mountain, did not move at all. It simply watched with an expression that, through the translation matrix, registered as something like respect. By the time Dara finished, the session had run 3 hours over schedule. The lights in the chamber had shifted from formal gold to the soft blue that signaled end of day. Voss Marin looked, for the first time in perhaps decades, slightly tired. Your analysis will be reviewed, the High Arbiter said. However, I caution you, pushing this matter further could have consequences for Earth's observer status. The Council values members who understand cooperation. Is that a threat? Dara asked. She did not sound afraid. She sounded genuinely curious, like someone trying to correctly label a new thing they had just encountered. It is a reality, Voss Marin said. Dara saved her documents, tucked her datapad under her arm, and ate the last bite of her protein bar. Okay, she said. I'll pass that along. She walked out of the chamber, nodding politely at the Kreth delegate as she passed. It dipped its massive head in return. 3 weeks later, Earth's response arrived in the Council's inbox. It was not a withdrawal of the grievance. It was not an apology. It was a counterfiling, twice as long as the original, this time co-signed by 4 other species who had quietly been waiting for someone else to go first. Species who had their own grievances, their own buried paperwork, their own silent injustices, sitting in the review queue for decades. Humanity had not started a fight. They had simply told the truth, loudly, in a room where nobody did that anymore. And it turned out a lot of people had been waiting for exactly that. The Council had tried to silence one small species. Instead, they had handed that species a microphone, and everyone else had leaned in to listen. The counterfiling broke something in the Council that had not been broken in a very long time. the comfortable assumption that silence meant agreement. For 6,000 years, the council had operated on a simple principle. If no one complained loudly enough to matter, then no one was truly unhappy. The system was self-sustaining. Species that were too small to push back stayed quiet. Species that were large enough to push back had usually already been given enough benefits to stay comfortable. The middle ground, the dozens of smaller civilizations, who had grievances but no power, had simply never found a voice worth listening to. Humanity had accidentally become that voice, the four species that co-signed Earth's counterfiling were not military powers. They were not rich. They were not old. The Vesari were a fungal collective intelligence from a humid moon in the outer systems who had been waiting 60 years for the council to process a water rights dispute. The Veil were a species of migratory gaseous beings who had formally requested recognition of their travel corridors for nearly a century and been politely ignored each time. The Muir were small, quiet, and deeply intelligent. They had contributed more to galactic medical science than any other species of their size, and the Council had been quietly redirecting the royalties from their patents to infrastructure projects without notification for 30 years. And then there were the Dacian, who were simply furious, had been furious for decades, and had never quite known what to do with it, together with Earth. These 5 species filed what became known informally across the galaxy as the Osei document, named without her knowledge or consent. After the young ambassador who had started reading legal text at a podium 4 hours past session close, the document was thorough. It was damning, and it was distributed through means that the Council's communications office would spend weeks trying to trace. To every registered news network operating in Council space that the Council convened in emergency session. Voss Marin presided, but something had shifted in the chamber. The old rhythms felt off. Delegates who had once voted as a comfortable bloc were now looking sideways at each other, wondering what their neighbors knew about their own buried paperwork. The Kreth representative, stone that outlasts the mountain, sat in its usual place, but it had brought 3 additional advisors. It had not done that in 40 years. Earth's assigned seat was still technically an observer bench, located at the back of the chamber with a partially obstructed view of the main dais. Dara sat there with her cracked data pad, a fresh protein bar, and a young man named Kofi, who was technically her assistant, but was actually the one who had organized the entire legal research operation that produced the counterfiling. He was 26. He had brought 2 extra data pads and a thermos of coffee. He looked absolutely delighted to be there. Voss Marin opened the session with language that was carefully chosen to sound like engagement while actually offering nothing. The filing had been received. It would be reviewed. The Council took the concerns of all affiliated species seriously. The standard processes existed for good reasons. Change, when it came, must come through proper channels. Dara's hand went up. Observer species did not raise hands during sessions. Voss Marin ignored her. Dara kept her hand up. The Veil representative, floating in its containment field in the 3rd row, extended one of its luminous tendrils in the same gesture. The Vesari delegate, a distributed presence across 7 linked nodes, activated its indicator lights simultaneously. One by one, 5 hands of their equivalents went up around the chamber, all from the co-signatories of the Osei document. Voss Marin continued speaking. She was experienced enough to run a session without acknowledging anything she did not want to acknowledge. But the chamber feeds were live. Every delegate present could see the raised hands on the secondary screens. The moment was being broadcast on 11 news networks. Stone, that outlasts the mountain, stood up. The Kreth standing during a session was not protocol. It was also impossible to ignore, given that the species averaged nearly 3 meters in height and 400 kilograms. Every head turned. Voss-Marin stopped mid-sentence. "The Kreth Dominion," Stone said, in its slow, geological voice, "formally requests that the Observer Coalition be granted temporary speaking rights for the duration of this session, under Article 9, Section 4 of the Founding Charter." Article 9, Section 4 was a provision so old it had never been invoked. It allowed any full council member to grant temporary speaking rights to any party present in the chamber. It had been written into the Charter as a theoretical safeguard against procedural abuse. No one had ever used it because no one had ever needed to, or rather, because no one had ever dared to doubt Voss-Marin's expression did not crack. But her secondary eyelids, which Selinari used involuntarily under stress, flickered twice. "The request is noted. A vote would be required. I call for an immediate vote," Stone said. The vote happened in 40 seconds. It passed. Not unanimously. The old bloc held together on 14 seats, but it passed. Because it turned out that when you watched a 31-year-old human stand at a podium for 4 hours reading the council's own laws back at them, and then watched the High Arbiter threaten her observer status as a response, something shifted in you, even if you had been comfortable for a long time. Dara walked to the podium for the second time. She looked different now, not more confident, exactly, but more certain. There is a difference. Confidence is about yourself. Certainty is about the thing you are saying. She did not begin with procedural language. She did not cite articles or subsections. She did something no speaker had done from that podium in living memory. She told a story. She described a family on Kepler 3, not an abstraction, not a statistic, a specific family, the Adamus, who had left Earth 18 years ago with 3 children, a cargo container of seeds, and a surveying drone that kept glitching in cold weather. She described what they had built, the way the colony smelled after rain, which was different from Earth rain because the soil was different, the school that had been constructed from prefab panels and repurposed ship hull plating, the greenhouse that had taken 6 years to get right. She described the supply ship that had stopped coming, the messages to council logistics that received automated responses, the children who were now teenagers and had never been to Earth and considered Kepler 3 home. These people did not ask for much, Dara said. They asked for the shipping lanes their settlement was built around. They asked for the fuel access that was promised when they applied for colonization rights. They did not ask for war. They did not ask for intervention. They asked to be left alone to build something. And the council took that away from them with a filing that most of this body has never read, decided by a committee that no one elected, to achieve an outcome that no one ever admitted to publicly. She paused. I want to know who authorized it. I want that name in the public record. And I want to know what this council plans to do about the 300,000 people it has been quietly trying to make disappear. The chamber was very still, and the Muir delegate, a small, gray-feathered being who had sat in this room for 60 years without speaking above a murmur, turned on its microphone. I also have a name I would like in the public record, it said, and a figure, 30 years of patent royalties. I would like that figure calculated and made public as well. The veil's tendrils brightened. The Vesari nodes pulsed. The Dacian representative slapped both its palms flat on its desk with a sound like a gunshot. Something irreversible had begun. The council had spent 18 months trying to erase a colony through silence. In doing so, they had handed 5 small civilizations a common cause, a legal framework, and a podium, and they had made the mistake of letting the galaxy watch Voss-Marin called a recess. In the hallway outside the chamber, for the first time in her 2 centuries of service, she did not know what came next. That was new. That was very, very new. The recess lasted 3 days. In those 3 days, more happened in the quiet corridors of the council station than had happened on the main floor in the previous century. Private meetings ran past midnight. Advisors who had served in the same positions for decades were suddenly working through the night. Secure communication channels that were supposed to be dormant lit up with traffic that would later be described in the official histories as unprecedented coordination among interested parties. In the news feeds across council space, the phrase "a coalition" appeared for the first time, coined by a Visari journalist who had been covering the council for 40 years and had never once had anything interesting to write about. Dara spent most of the recess in a small meeting room near the station's outer ring with Kofi, 3 representatives from the co-signatory species, and a Kreth legal advisor named Rel, who had been sent by stone that outlasts the mountain without explanation and had simply shown up at their door, carrying a data terminal the size of a dining table. Rel did not say much. It cross-referenced. Occasionally, it would make a low sound in its chest and highlight a section of text, and everyone in the room would lean over to look at what it had found. What it kept finding was more of the same. Buried resolutions, rerouted funds, quietly altered agreements, administrative decisions made in committees with no public minutes and no member notification. Every time Rel found one, it added it to a document that was growing longer by the hour dot by the end of the second day. The document was not just about Earth's colonies anymore. It was about the Visari water rights. It was about Vale transit corridors that had been systematically denied for 90 years. It was about Muir patents. It was about 17 other species who had been quietly approached during the recess by the Aussay Coalition. Species who had heard what happened in the chamber and sent cautious, careful messages through intermediaries, asking, not committing, just asking whether there was a process for adding grievances to the record. There was a very good legal process for exactly that. Kofi had set it up on a shared server at 2 a.m. because he had not slept and was running on coffee and the specific kind of furious energy that comes from realizing the scale of what you have stumbled into. When the council session resumed on the 4th day, Voss Marin walked in looking composed. She had spent the recess doing what 6,000-year-old institutions do when threatened. She had called in every favor, shored up every alliance, and prepared a procedural response so thorough and so layered and legitimate sounding, language that most observers would need 3 readings to understand. It was essentially nothing. The council would form a review committee. The committee would have broad authority to examine the concerns raised. It would report back in due course. In the meantime, all filed grievances would enter the standard review process doc. She was halfway through presenting it when Dara stood up. She did not raise her hand this time. She simply stood, and because she now had full temporary speaking rights, the protocol gave her the floor between agenda items. Voss Marin finished her sentence, then turned her faceted eyes toward the back of the chamber. "I appreciate the proposal," Dara said. "I have 3 questions. First, will the review committee have the authority to make binding decisions or advisory ones? Second, will its proceedings be public? And third, who will sit on it, and will any of those members recuse themselves from reviewing decisions they personally authorized?" The chamber went very quiet. The proposal, it turned out, had answers to none of these questions. The committee's authority was deliberately unspecified. Its proceedings were not mentioned. Its membership had not been named, and given that most of the decisions now under scrutiny had been made by the same small group of senior delegates who had run the council for decades, the question of recusal was not merely procedural, it was existential. Voss Marin said the details would be worked out in good faith. Rel, sitting in the expanded observer section that had been arranged for the coalition, tapped a single key on its enormous data terminal. A document appeared on every screen in the chamber, every delegate feed, every public broadcast, every secondary display. It was the full compilation. Every buried resolution, every rerouted fund, every altered agreement that Rel had found over 3 days of reading. 47 items. 17 species affected. 6,000 years of council authority, and at the end of it, 47 quiet little betrayals that had never been entered into any public record. "We are prepared," Dara said, "to enter all of this into evidence and request a full independent audit, not a committee, not a review, but an audit, conducted by parties with no existing relationship to this body, under Article 31 of the Galactic Accountability Standards." She looked around the room. "We have the co-signatures for the request. We filed them this morning." Article 31 required only 12 co-signatories from registered species. The Asai Coalition had 23. The old block of delegates that had held the Council's comfortable majority for generations began to fracture right there. On camera, in front of 11 news networks, and the watching eyes of 40 civilizations. It did not fracture grammatically. There were no shouts, no walked-out resignations, none of the theatrical rebellion that people who did not understand politics might have expected. It fractured the way ice fractures, silently, invisibly, along cracks that had been forming for a very long time, until suddenly the whole structure was in pieces, and no one could quite say when it had stopped being solid. 3 delegates from the old block, 2 Selenari and a Vorith, quietly moved to the abstention column on the Article 31 vote. They did not vote with the coalition, but they did not vote against it either. In a body where every decision for 2 centuries had been unanimous among the core membership, abstention was revolution. The audit passed. Voss Meren declared the session adjourned and left the chamber without speaking. Her assistant, a young Selenari named Tor, who had served in the position for 11 years, watched her go and then remained seated for a long time, staring at the document still displayed on every screen. In the hallway, something unusual was happening. Delegates who had never spoken to each other were speaking, not in the formal language of diplomatic exchange, but in the actual language of people who had just watched something shift and were trying to understand what it meant. A Kreth advisor was in quiet conversation with a Vale representative. A Muir delegate was being approached by species from the outer rim that had observer status and had never been spoken to directly by a full council member in the entire time they had held it. Dara walked through all of it on her way back to the observer wing. People looked at her differently now, not with the polite dismissal of the first day, and not quite with the admiration that made her uncomfortable when she caught it on faces, but with something more honest, the look of people trying to figure out what she actually was and what happened. Next, Kofi caught up with her at the corridor junction. 26 new species have sent contact requests, he said, looking at his datapad. 14 of them want to add grievances to the audit record. 6 of them want legal consultations. 3 of them just want to talk. Dara kept walking. "Tell them we'll talk. We don't have a staff for this." "Then we get one." Kofi looked at her sideways. He had known her for 2 years, had watched her take this assignment that no one else wanted, had watched her read for 4 hours without stopping, had watched her stand in that chamber and say things that apparently no one had said out loud in centuries. He had a feeling, the specific, irreversible feeling of standing at the beginning of something enormous that he would be telling stories about this period for the rest of his life. "You know the Council is going to fight back," he said. "Yeah," Dara said. "I know. They have 6,000 years of institutional power. They have relationships with every major military force in Council space. They have resources we can't even measure." "I know," she said again. "So what's the plan?" Dara thought about the Adeimi family on Kepler 3. She thought about the school made of repurposed hull plating. She thought about teenagers who had never been to Earth and had built something real in the cold soil of a world 3-star systems away, and about the bureaucratic machinery that had quietly decided those teenagers did not deserve to exist there. Keep telling the truth, she said, loudly, until they run out of ways to ignore it. It was not, by any military or political standard, a strategy. But then again, humanity had never really operated by other species' standards. It was becoming clear, partly why they were so hard to stop. The audit took 8 months. In galactic terms, that was nothing. A blink, a breath, a footnote in the margin of a history that measured itself in millennia. In human terms, it was 8 months of 18-hour days, of legal teams working across time zones and star systems, of Kofi surviving almost entirely on coffee, and the dangerous confidence of a person who has realized he is very good at something that matters enormously. The auditors were a team of 42 individuals drawn from 11 species, none of which had any existing relationship with the Council. They had been chosen by a joint process that the Coalition had spent 3 weeks negotiating, and they were, without exception, the most thorough and methodical beings Dara had ever encountered. They found everything, not just the 47 items in Rel's original document, not just the grievances filed by the Coalition's 23 co-signatories. They found things that no one in the Coalition had even looked for. Administrative decisions buried so deep in the Council's procedural record that they had never been intended for any eyes at all. Resource allocation schemes that had been quietly enriching the same 6 families of Selenari traders for 200 years. Habitat preservation agreements that had been signed publicly and then silently amended in back-channel filings that contradicted the public versions. A border arbitration decision from 80 years ago that had given a Vorith mining consortium access to a system legally belonging to a species that had since gone extinct, a species whose extinction, the auditors noted with careful, devastating neutrality, had been preceded by the loss of the mineral income that had sustained their economy. That last one landed differently than the rest. It was not active destruction. It was not a weapon or a war. It was paperwork and patience, and the slow, grinding weight of institutional power applied so consistently over decades that an entire civilization had simply stopped being viable. It was the same mechanism that had been applied to Earth's colonies, just finished further, just taken to its end. When the audit report was released, it was not released quietly. It was distributed simultaneously to every registered news network in Council space, to every diplomatic mission, to every species with observer status or above, and through a channel that the Coalition had been quietly building for 6 months. With Rel's help and the Visari's communication infrastructure, directly to the general public of 37 civilizations. Not summarized, not filtered. The full report, all 912 pages, with appendices. The Council's public response was measured and institutional. A formal statement of concern, a commitment to reform, an announcement that High Arbiter Vos Marin would be stepping aside to allow for new leadership during the transition period, a phrase that was carefully chosen to sound voluntary. Whether it was voluntary was a question that no one in the public record answered directly, and that everyone in the diplomatic community understood completely. The real response happened elsewhere. It happened in the 17 military alliance agreements that quietly began to shift as junior members began asking questions their senior partners could not comfortably answer. It happened in the trade negotiations that suddenly stalled across 4 systems as parties who had previously accepted the Council's arbitration began requesting independent review. It happened in the 22 new petitions for full Council membership filed by observer species who had watched the audit process and concluded, correctly, that the difference between a species with a voice and a species without one had never been more clearly demonstrated, and it happened on Kepler 3. 3 weeks after the audit release, when a supply ship arrived. It was not a council ship. It was a private hauler, contracted through a newly negotiated agreement that Earth's diplomatic mission, now significantly larger than one person with a cracked datapad, had arranged through the Thesari, who had water rights now, and the Muir, who had begun receiving compensation for 30 years of redirected royalties, and 3 other species, who had decided that the most practical response to the audit was to build the network of mutual trade that the Council had always discouraged because a web of direct relationships between smaller species was, structurally, much harder to control than a hub-and-spoke system with the Council at the center. The Adami family watched the supply ship land from the window of the greenhouse that had taken 6 years to get right. The youngest, who was 8 and had been born on Kepler 3 and had no memory of the months when the supply stopped coming, asked her mother what was in the containers. Her mother, who remembered those months very well, said everything they needed. Her oldest, 17 now, watched the loading crews in their suits moving through the thin cold air and asked who had sent them. Humans, his mother said, and a fungus, and a cloud, and some feathery gray people who turned out to be very good lawyers. She thought about it. It's a long story. He looked at the ship for a long time. Are we safe now? She did not answer immediately, because she was honest, and it was not a simple question. The Council still existed. The old block had fractured, but not dissolved. Los Marin was gone, but the systems she had run for 2 centuries were still largely in place, staffed by people who had built careers within them and were not eager to see them changed. The audit had exposed everything, but exposure was not the same as resolution, and resolution was not the same as justice. And justice in a galaxy this old and this complicated was not a destination you arrived at, but a direction you kept walking in. But the shipping lanes were open. The fuel stations had been legally challenged, and 3 of them were already in a process that would reassign access. 22 new species were filing for full membership, and when they got it, the voting math in the chamber would change permanently. The Ausse Coalition had incorporated itself as a formal body and filed for status as a registered advocacy organization under galactic law, which meant it had a legal standing that could not be quietly bureaucratized away. Kofi had hired 11 people and was interviewing 20 more. Rel had, without being asked, simply continued showing up. Yeah, she finally said. I think we're getting there. Back on the station above Vorith 9, Dara was packing up the small office that the Coalition had been given, upgraded from the observer bench to an actual room with a door that locked, which felt like a statement. The walls were covered in data sheets and cross-referenced documents, and a timeline that Kofi had drawn by hand because the digital versions kept being updated too fast to read. It looked like the inside of a mind that had been working very hard for a very long time. She sat at the desk for a moment, with her hands flat on the surface. She thought about the day she had walked into this station, in a second-hand suit with a cracked datapad, 9 days into an ambassadorship that no one expected to matter. She thought about what Los Marin had said, that she was a young species, that she had much to learn about how the galaxy operated. She did not disagree. They had learned a great deal. They had learned that the galaxy operated on silence and patience, and the comfortable assumption that people who were being erased would accept it because the alternative seemed too large. They had learned that 6,000 years of institutional power was impressive, right up until the moment someone started reading the fine print. They had learned that the same legal frameworks built to make challenges impossible could, if read carefully and applied with total commitment, make challenges not just possible, but inevitable. The galaxy had rules. That was still true. But it turned out that reading the rules all the way to the end changed what they meant considerably. She picked up her datapad, a new one. No cracks, a gift from the Muir delegation with a card that said, in their precise and careful script, for the one who read. She closed the last of her files. She thought about 47 buried decisions, and a supply ship landing in cold soil, and a 17-year-old watching it come down and asking if they were safe now. Humanity had not come to the galaxy with an army. They had not come with vast resources or ancient alliances or centuries of accumulated power. They had come with a cracked datapad and a grievance and the specific, maddening human tendency to keep talking after everyone else had decided the conversation was over. They had told the truth loudly in a room that had forgotten what loudness felt like. And the galaxy, it turned out, had been waiting for exactly that. Not rescue, not revolution, but simply someone willing to say, clearly and without apology, that the rules applied to everyone, including the people who had written them. The Council had tried to silence humanity. They had been quiet about it, patient about it, procedurally impeccable about it. And in doing so, they had created the one thing they could not control, a reason to keep talking, a coalition, a public record, a name in the history books that would be taught to children on 37 worlds who would grow up knowing that the galaxy's rules could be read, challenged, and changed not without a fight, not without cost, but changed. Dara walked out of the office, turned off the light, and went to find Kofi, because there were 22 new membership petitions to review, and someone had to do the work.